donation. Your support allows us to host programs like this at no charge. A special thank you to tonight's program sponsor, the PNC Foundation, and to the Farmington Community Library and the West Bloomfield Township Public Library for being our community partners. Today, January 27, marks the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. In 2005, the United Nations General Assembly designated that day as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It is meant to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazism, including the Roma Sinti, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and Jehovah's Witnesses. That same resolution promotes Holocaust education around the world and rejects any form of Holocaust denial. As we witnessed at Colleyville, Texas, in their synagogue earlier this month, the lessons of this history are more relevant than ever. We must continue to stand up against anti-Semitism, hatred, and genocide. Now, I would like to introduce our featured speaker. Dr. David Fishman is a professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He serves as director of Project Judaica at the Kiev Mohyla Academy University in Ukraine, and directs the Jewish Archival Survey, which publishes guides to Jewish materials in the archives of the former Soviet Union. Dr. Fishman is the author of numerous books and articles on the history and culture of East European Jewry. His book, the book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis, was a 7-year labor of love and has been hailed as the Monuments Men for book lovers. We are thrilled to have the special exhibit based on his book here at the Zeckelman Holocaust Center through May. David, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Ali. Good evening to everyone. It's a special privilege and to be with you on this very special date, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and to tell you a story that is in some ways tragic, but in most ways uplifting and inspiring about the rescue of cultural treasures, of Jewish cultural treasures from the Nazis by ghetto inmates during the Holocaust. And I'm going to tell this story through images, through slides, and narrate my way through it. This is truly just a synopsis and some observations based on my book, the book Smugglers, which has appeared recently in Hebrew and in many other languages. And I'd want to begin with a personal story, really, which is how I came to this topic, which brings me back to when I was young, 32 years ago. I was a freshly minted PhD and a young assistant professor. And I got a phone call from the director of the YIVO Institute here in New York, which is an institute to study the Jews of Eastern Europe and Yiddish culture. And he said to me, you know, we just found out that there are mountains of Jewish books and papers in Vilnius, the capital of Soviet Lithuania. It was still the Soviet Union. Will you go to Vilnius to make sense of what's there? What kind of material is it? I jumped at the opportunity. We went. It wasn't just in Vilnius. It was in a former church, a former monastery, which the Soviets had converted into a book repository. We got there, and piles, mountains and mountains of old Hebrew and Yiddish books, manuscripts and documents, a kaleidoscope of the Jewish experience in Eastern Europe. It was a very moving experience for me to see all of that. And the first question was, how did it survive? How did it reach us? What it is doing here in a former church in Lithuania, Soviet Lithuania in 1989. And I did some digging. I wrote an article, but I put the topic away. I came back to it more than 20 years later and started researching and came up with this book. The story takes place in Vilna, which before the war belonged to Poland. Today, it's Vilnius, the capital of independent Lithuania. Even when it belonged to Poland, Jews called this city Yerushalayim Delita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And that's a very special name. Not every Jewish community is called Jerusalem. Whenever you see that in Jewish history, you know it's a special community with a special cultural, religious, or intellectual heritage. And that was the case with Vilna. Its special intellectual tradition begins with this Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon, who really stressed that it was study of the holy books that was the paramount commandment in Judaism. Study of the Bible, of the Talmud, of the Midrash, etc. Even more, he thought, than prayer and then ritual, even more than acts of kindness, it was study was the way that you connected with God. And he created this tradition of intellectualism, of book culture, and of learning in this city, which persisted from his time down until the Holocaust. Vilna was not, by any stretch of the imagination, the largest Jewish community of Eastern Europe. There were, on the eve of the German occupation, 70,000 Jews in this community, though those 70,000 were a third of the city's total population. But Warsaw was bigger, Lodz was bigger, Odessa was bigger, many places were bigger, but it was the cultural and religious capital of East European Jewry. As a center of scholars and of academies, it became a major center of printing. In the 19th century, of religious literature, such as the Vilna edition of the Talmud, which is on the left, Judaism's second most sacred book, the Talmud. Its classical edition was what we call the Vilna Shas, the Vilna edition of the Talmud. And then in the 20th century, when Jews became more modern and more secular, Vilna was a center of Yiddish printing, of Yiddish publishing. You see here a potpourri of Yiddish newspapers and magazines published in Vilna. At its peak, there were 5 daily Yiddish newspapers in Vilna. Again, a city with only 70,000 Jews had 5 daily Jewish newspapers. It was a city of readers. And it's one of its preeminent institutions is the building here in the foreground, which was the Strashun Library, the Jewish Community Library of Vilna, which was the greatest library under Jewish auspices in Europe. It had 5 incunabula, Hebrew incunabula, that's Hebrew books printed before the year 1500. They're great rarities. And it had hundreds of books from the 1500s. And it was a kind of communal cultural center. This is the reading room of the Strashun Library, which brought Jews of all stripes who wanted to study, who wanted to read, who wanted to research. Vilna also had the greatest Jewish archive in Europe, centered at the YIVO Institute. The very same YIVO that invited me in 1989 was founded originally in Vilna in 1925. And this archive included the records of community organizations, of synagogues. It included the personal records of writers, of community leaders, and manifold historical documents. YIVO had its own reading room, all kinds of public education. And besides these 2 great institutions, Vilna had many other collections of Jewish cultural treasures, a museum, yeshivas, seminaries, and private collections, because if it's a city of scholars and writers, it's going to be a city with many great private collections. Last but not least, to set up the stage, it was also a city of creativity, not only of passive reading, but of writing. And this is the literary group Jung Vilna and its magazine, the Jung Vilna magazine, a group of poets, fiction writers, novelists, and a couple of plastic artists thrown in as well. For our story, these two writers will be central. This is Shmerke Kaczerginski. Shmerke was an orphan. His parents died in World War I. He was raised in an orphanage and grew up to be a poet. He's a man of the left. He belonged to the underground Communist Party in Poland, and is very much a political poet. Next to him, his good friend Avram Sutzkever, the grandson of a rabbi, but very different than his buddy, and a nature poet, someone who wrote about snow, about trees. Apolitical, he said. I'm not religious. I'm not Orthodox. I'm not a Zionist. I'm not a socialist. The only ideology I believe in is poetry. And now let's move on to the body. Now that I've introduced you to Vilna, the Yerushalayim Delita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, where this story takes place, let's move on to the Holocaust period. The Germans came to Vilna, seized Vilna in late June of 1941. Not in September 1939 when they attacked Poland and soon thereafter conquered Warsaw, but only almost 2 years later when they began the war against the Soviet Union. They came later, but they worked faster. In the 6 months after the German invasion, from July till December of 1941, the Jewish population of Vilna decreased from 70,000 to 20,000. More than 2/3 of the Jews of Vilna were murdered in those 6 months. They were not sent to Auschwitz or Treblinka. Those camps didn't even exist in the second half of 1941. Instead, they were taken to the outskirts of town, to a place called Ponare, with deep pits, and were simply mowed down by machine gun in successive raids, roundups, and massacres. There were originally 2 Vilna ghettos, but the second ghetto was entirely liquidated, just about all of its inhabitants murdered. And it is the first ghetto where 20,000 Jews remained, beginning in January 1942, when the massive murdering stopped. At least for the next year and a half, there, from January 42 till mid-43, there would be what was called the period of stability in the Vilna ghetto. Stability meant there were small atrocities, but not massive and systematic ones. The life of ghetto inmates was a grim, difficult routine. This is the gate to the Vilna ghetto. Most inmates lived in the ghetto, which was enormously cramped, with 15 to 20 people in a room, people sleeping on tables, people sleeping on the bathtub. And they lived in the ghetto, but they worked outside the ghetto. Every day they were marched out to different sites where they served as basically slave laborers, whether it be a factory, whether the railway station, in different places. When they came back from that workday, they tried, if they could, to smuggle food into the ghetto past whatever guards were there. There were Lithuanian guards, police guards. There were even Jewish ghetto police. But the most perilous was if there were Germans at the gate. There were body searches, and if an inmate was caught carrying food, they could be sent to their death just for that. There was an opera singer in the Vilna ghetto, Lyuba Levitskaya. She tried to bring in a bag of peas for her family, for her elderly mother. She was caught at the gate, and she was sent to her death in Ponar for that bag of peas. And the inmates hope against hope that maybe the Red Army, the Soviets, will come in and liberate them from the Germans before it's too late. Now, this is a crucial part of the story. The organization, the Nazi German organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, the special squad of the German Reichsleader Alfred Rosenberg. This is an agency to loot cultural treasures all across Europe. The master race, the Aryan race, the Germans, should have the master library, the master museum, the master everything should belong to them. So they stole rare books, artwork, and all kinds of cultural treasures all across Europe, from Paris and Amsterdam to Salonika and everywhere in between, for their collections. What is not as well known is that this organization, the ERR, had a special Judaica department, which looted and stole Hebrew and Yiddish books all across Europe. This is Dr. Johannes Paul, the head of the Judaica department of the ERR. It is very ironic. Yes, at the same time that the Germans are murdering Jews massively, they are collecting, if one can call it that, Jewish books. They're doing that for the sake of what they called Judenforschung, study of the Jews, anti-Semitic Jewish studies. The Nazis wanted to prove scientifically that their racial theory was correct, that the Jews were subhuman and at the same time a great peril to the Aryan race, degenerate, debased, evil, and therefore through science, through scholarship, they would prove the need to persecute and exterminate the Jews. They had specialists who knew Hebrew and Yiddish, such as Dr. Paul himself, who churned out this anti-Semitic Judenforschung, and the books and the papers were for them, so that for all eternity, mankind would know just how harmful this race was and just how gracious the Germans had been in exterminating them. Dr. Paul, here you can see an example of a book, Hebrew book stolen by the ERR, sent to an institute called the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question, a Hebrew book with a Nazi swastika. Dr. Paul knew that Vilna is special, that it's got this great library, it's got this great archive, that it's not just another point on the map. In terms of his job, looting Judaica, it is the most important place on the map. And he arrived in Vilna just a week or two after the Wehrmacht, after the German army arrived. He arrived in early July of 1941. And even Dr. Paul, who knew a lot, was amazed, was stunned by the riches and the enormous volume of the Judaica collections there. And he didn't know what to do because he can't send it all to Germany. It's just too much. And he doesn't need to send 5, 6 copies of the same book to Germany. And that's when he came up with an idea. He'll have to create a slave labor brigade of Jews who will sort the material. What should be sent to Germany, and the rest, if it's not going to be sent to Germany, should be disposed of as trash, as garbage. And so he needs Jewish slave laborers, and he creates such a brigade, which got the nickname the Paper Brigade. The head of this Paper Brigade was Herman Crook, a professional librarian from before the war, a refugee from Warsaw. Crook was a secular Jew, a socialist, a member of the Jewish Labor Bund, but a great bibliographer. His deputy, these are people basically forcibly hired by the Germans. They had no choice but to take on these positions. His deputy was Zelig Kalmanovich, a scholar from the YIVO Institute, who by this point in his life was a Zionist. His son, Sholem, lived in Eretz Yisrael from the mid-1930s. And Zelig Kalmanovich was also a religious believer, a pious man at this stage, and also a great scholar of all aspects of Judaism. And they had a brigade of 20 intellectuals who are going to do the sorting. And the Germans created a quota. Only 30% can be sent to Germany. 70% will have to be disposed of as trash. And the members of this brigade, the intellectual brigade as it was called, are whatever was left of the Jewish intelligentsia of Vilna. Scholars, educators, writers, and even one or two artists and musicians. And our poets that we mentioned earlier joined as slave laborers this brigade. Schmerke, the orphan and communist, Sutzgewer, the apolitical nature poet, worked for this brigade. And I only want to mention one more person, special person who worked in this sort of thankless, terrible job. And that is the woman here in the middle with the two poets. And that is Rachael Krinsky, Pupko Krinsky. She was a high school teacher of history. She had a master's degree in history from Vilna University. She knew Latin, she knew Old Polish. She has a very special and in some ways tragic and dramatic personal story. Her husband was murdered literally a week or two after the Germans entered the city, one of the very, very first roundups. So she's a widow. They had a 2-year-old daughter. And when the ghetto was established and all Jews are forcibly herded into the ghetto in early September of 1941, she decides she's not taking her daughter into the ghetto. She hands her daughter over to her Polish nanny and says, you take her and keep her. And the nanny moves to another part of the city where neighbors don't recognize her and raises that girl for the duration of the war. That girl will not see her mother for the next 4 years. And Rachael Krinsky will enter the ghetto alone, without her husband, without her daughter. Her only strength and support are her friends and her love of poetry. And the work begins. The building where they work is the former YIVO building. So you have a great collection there already, but you don't even have to move. Though all other collections are moved into this building, Jewish and not even non-Jewish. And the building is an enormous collection of piles of books being sorted, this to Germany, that to trash. And for them, this is a form of torture. They are being forced to participate in the looting and destruction of their own culture. They're book lovers, and they're forced to stand by and look as bulldozers come and take piles and piles of books away to be disposed of as trash. And truth be told, they cannot live with themselves that way, being collaborators in this project of cultural destruction, of not only the Jews being murdered, but their culture being destroyed. And they have to come up with another plan. How do you save at least some of this material? And the plan they come up with initially, the main idea they have, is the idea all Jews have, which is you smuggle the material into the ghetto. I bring this slide to show you just how terrible the emotions are, right? This is a piece of a Torah scroll, but the Germans used them, since they're made out of parchment, not out of paper, to repair Nazi army boots. And you had cut up Torah scrolls. And this captures both the sense of desecration and the burning anger that the members of the paper brigade had towards what the Germans were doing. So they decide they're smuggling material, just like everybody smuggled potatoes and food into the ghetto to the best of their ability. They're going to smuggle the books and papers under their clothing daily after work into the ghetto, sometimes like a diaper inside their pants, sometimes like a girdle. And the moment of truth in this whole operation is when they get to the gate. If there are Lithuanians at the gate or if there are Jews at the gate, that's not very dangerous. But if there are Germans at the gate, then they can be sent to their death. And there are many dramatic scenes that happen at the gate. Rachael Krinsky, for instance, one time tried to smuggle a Kiddush cup, a goblet for the blessing over wine on Friday nights, a old and beautiful religious artifact. The German at the gate found it, and everyone was sure Rachael Krinsky is now going to be sent to her death. But she turned it around quickly and she said, I'm not hiding this. Actually, I wanted to give this to you, the German, as a present. Take it. And I also happen to have a nice pair of gloves for your wife. And basically, the German accepted the bribe. He was in a good mood. A silver item can be smelted down and it's worth money. And he let her through. She was just plain lucky. In general, the group was very lucky. Some of the members were beaten badly at the ghetto gate when material was found on their bodies, but none of them were sent to their deaths at the gate. This operation went on for a year and a half. 20 people smuggling, let's say, 2 items a day, over 500 work days comes to 20,000 items, which can be passed through. And that's what they did. Once the material was in the ghetto, they hid it in a bunker. This is a bunker underneath the ground of the Vilna ghetto. It was built by a Jewish construction engineer. And you entered with a ladder that was going to take you down to the sewage system, but then it went deeper. And there were 2 types of things kept in this bunker. One were the books, the papers, the cultural treasures. But the other, one of the main reasons why this bunker was built was to keep arms, guns, munition. There was a partisan organization in the Vilna ghetto, a resistance organization, planning a great Vilna ghetto uprising. And that's where they kept their arms. So side by side, you had the expressions of 2 forms of resistance, the plans for armed resistance against the Nazis, and also the material for this moral and spiritual resistance against the Nazis. And there was another way that materials were rescued, and that was with non-Jewish friends. This is Ona Shemaitya, an ethnic Lithuanian, non-Jew, professional librarian at the university library, and she rescued a great deal of Jewish books and papers. How is quite peculiar. The Germans left the work site, the evil building, for lunch daily, for an hour or more. They didn't leave anybody supervising the slave laborers for that hour. But of course, no one would escape, because if anyone escaped, there'd be collective reprisal. Their family, their friends, their apartment, maybe hundreds of people would have been murdered if anybody escaped. So they're there in the building, left to their devices. And non-Jewish friends could come during the lunch hour to meet them, as long as they left within the hour before the Germans came. And they could take out with them from this site thousands of, over the course of a year and a half, thousands of larger items, such as artwork and large books that couldn't be hidden under your clothing. To move the story forward, our 2 poets survive. They survived because they were members of also of the armed resistance in the Vilna ghetto. And they were able to escape the ghetto literally a week before the ghetto was dissolved and all its remaining inmates were sent to camps and overwhelmingly sent to their deaths. They got out, some of them got out, people like them, through the sewage system. You literally entered a manhole, you crawled through the pipes, filthy pipes, until you were out on the other side, then you got to the forest, and they survived. The heads of this brigade, the socialist librarian, the religious and Zionist scholar, they perished. They were sent to camps in Estonia when the ghetto was liquidated, dissolved, and eventually murdered there. Rachael Krinsky, the mother of that little girl, the high school teacher of history, she was sent to a different camp, Stutthof, which was originally a labor camp, but then in 1944 was also made into a death camp. It was an overflow camp for Auschwitz. Auschwitz was working at full capacity, taking in and murdering Hungarian Jews. So remaining Jews from Poland and Lithuania were sent to Stutthof, which had a crematorium. And Rachael expected, as she saw the smoke go up from the crematorium, but someday soon her body too will be burnt in the crematorium. She was very, very lucky to survive this camp, but she survived a very broken woman. She writes letters right after the liberation of Vilna, of the camp. And she writes to friends and she says, I see other people are resuming life. People are falling in love. People are having fun. I really can't do it. I can't catch the rhythm of this new life. I don't see any purpose in it. In fact, she didn't even write to her brother in America to say that she survived. She's deeply depressed. The only healthy instinct she had was that she wanted to reunite with her daughter. And she writes in those early letters, it's not that I can do anything for my daughter. In my current state, I can do nothing for my daughter. And what I heard in the ghetto, the nanny has done a great job raising my daughter. But maybe my daughter can do something for me. Maybe I'll find some kind of value and meaning in this new life if I reunite with my daughter. And she will eventually. I'll get to that. Vilna is liberated by the Red Army, July 13th, 1944. But as far as Jewish Vilna, were originally no Jews on the streets, and it's a pale shadow of its former self. It's a city of ruins. This is the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon after the liberation, in ruins. This is the building of Yivo, of the Yiddish Institute, hit directly by a bomb in the battle for Vilna, right after the liberation. The poets return to this city of ghosts and of ruins, mainly for one reason, because they have to finish the job. They have to dig up the material that they hid under the Nazis. They owe it, first of all, to their colleagues who they know have been murdered. They owe it to the Jewish people who they believe will need this in the future, will need their books, their archives, their documents, their cultural treasure. And they come to Vilna and organize a rescue operation, a retrieval operation. They work with shovels, or picks, simple, very primitive material, or with their bare hands to dig up what they can, create these kind of hand wagons. And they find fragments of Torah scrolls, but not a single whole Torah scroll. And they find artwork, old newspapers. Actually, they find a great, great deal rescued by them and also kept in other places. And together, the poets created a Jewish museum in Vilna, created 2 weeks after the liberation of the city, very quickly. And they get a building in the former ghetto with a large courtyard. That courtyard during the ghetto years had been used as a sports field. The building itself is in terrible shape, no glass in the windows, lots of ruined walls and rubble. And when they collect material, a lot of the material is kept in the courtyard outdoors until they can get the building into some basic shape. But they hadn't thought of one thing, which was that they are now in the Soviet Union, in Soviet-controlled Lithuania. And the head of, sent from Moscow to take control of Lithuania is this man, Mikhail Suslov, and he is a close associate of Joseph Stalin. Suslov is dead set against there being any kind of Jewish life in post-war Vilnius, and he wants to close this museum down. He does it in stages, gradually, but he basically chokes the museum or starves it. No budget, no assistance, no nothing. And then the dramatic moment comes when one night the sanitation department comes and takes away everything that was in the courtyard. Many books, many papers, many treasures. And that's when our poets realize that the materials are in danger again. They must be rescued. They must be rescued yet again, because they're in just as much danger under the Soviets with Mikhail Suslov as they were under the Nazis with Johannes Paul. And the way to rescue material is to smuggle it out of the country. Both of the poets had the right to leave the Soviet Union because before the war, they were Polish citizens. And Polish citizens were allowed to repatriate, return to Poland. So they plan a smuggling operation of suitcases, both they and many other survivors who take it out of the country from Soviet Lithuania to Poland. Here are the two poets we've talked about in Poland. But they don't want to stay in Poland, and they will move on and smuggle it again to Paris, and they'll send the material to the reconstituted YIVO in New York. The Vilna material mainly sent from Poland, from Paris, on to New York, though Sutzkever will hold on to much of it and actually end up eventually taking it to Israel. What happened to Rachael Krinsky? She also came to Poland from that camp, Stutthof, near Danzig, near Gdansk. She went to lodge in Poland, wrote to the nanny and said, "You're a Polish nanny. You have a right to move to Poland. Come to Poland with my daughter and bring my daughter to me." And the daughter and mother reunite after 4 years of separation. The 2-year-old she left is now a 6-year-old. This girl does not recognize this woman as being her mother. From her perspective, the nanny is her mother. And the three live together for months in a rather difficult and strange triangle. And Rachael rebuilds the relationship with her daughter until she can write to friends and say in letters, "I am her mother again." The Jewish Museum in Vilna was closed down. Suslov had his way. It was liquidated in 1949. And all of its materials were sent to Lithuanian repositories, the main one being this book repository, the former church, where it lay in mountains and in different places for 40 years, from 1949 till 1989, when the YIVO delegation, including me, saw this material for the first time. Now I'd like to quickly tell you, to wrap up, two final things. First, what kind of things did they rescue? I keep on talking about books and papers and things. Here are examples, just a few. A diary by Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism. The record book of the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. The synagogue was destroyed. You saw a picture of the ruins, but its minute books cover 150 years from the lifetime of the Vilna Gaon in the late 1700s down to the 1920s. It's a very valuable historical document. Many letters by Sholem Aleichem, the great Yiddish author, the author of Tevye the Dairyman, which later was adapted to become Fiddler on the Roof. A bust of Leon Tolstoy, which was done by a Jewish sculptor, Ilya Ginsburg, who developed a personal relationship with Tolstoy, and Tolstoy posed for him for this bust. And finally, material from the Ghetto period itself, the archive of the Vilna Ghetto. This is a call to arms by the partisan resistance of the Vilna Ghetto, which the first line actually says in Yiddish, don't go like sheep to the slaughter, be ready to fight. This too was rescued and smuggled out. Of course, not everything could be smuggled out. Many of the items, most of the items remained in that church in Lithuania. Some, a good proportion were smuggled out and ended up in New York and in Israel. What happened to our heroes? Sutzkever from Paris settled in Israel, actually fought in the Israeli War of Independence, had a very long career as a poet in Yiddish in Israel. Among his readers and friends were Golda Meir. After all, Golda Meir knew Yiddish well. Zalman Shazar, one of the presidents of Israel, also a friend and a reader. Shmerke Kaczerginski stopped being a communist as the Soviet experience definitely disillusioned him with communism. He ended up settling in Argentina, where he headed a Jewish culture organization, Congress for Jewish Culture. And when he took that job, he announced, he said, I know what it means to be devoted to Jewish culture. My colleagues and I in the paper brigade showed what it means to be devoted to Jewish culture, and I promise the same level of devotion here in Argentina. Rachael Krinsky eventually came to America. She had a brother in New York, and she remarried. Lo and behold, in 1945, she had scoffed that she could never imagine remarrying. But she did, a fellow survivor from the Vilna Ghetto. She raised her daughter. They lived most of the years in New Jersey, Teaneck and other areas in New Jersey, and lived to see her granddaughter, Alex, grow up. Alex now lives in Berkeley in the Bay Area. So this is a remarkable story of heroism of a different type. People who literally risk their lives for the sake of Jewish books, documents, and Jewish culture. If a hero is someone who is willing to die for something noble that is bigger than them, they're not thinking about themselves, but they're saying, no, this is so important, I'll do it. So even if I die, then that's then they're definitely heroes. They made a kind of, I would say, existential decision. I'm probably going to be murdered, but whatever I have left of my time, I'm going to spend rescuing, doing something valuable, something meaningful. And for me, that's rescuing books, Jewish books, and Jewish cultural material. I would rather be murdered smuggling a rare book than be murdered smuggling a potato or a bag of peas. Final reflection as I conclude, which is, I realized many years later what drew me to this topic, and because I realized that this topic is in some ways a metaphor for Jewish existence and Jewish perseverance. What did they do? They rescued what they could rescue, they dug it up, and then they moved it on when it could no longer stay where it was. And I think in many ways, that's what's called upon Jews today, to retrieve from their tradition, from their heritage, whatever they can, whatever they feel comfortable, whatever they're able to dig into it and to study it, to dig it up. Don't just have it, but truly explore it. And finally, to pass it on to our children, to future generations. And it's also a wonderful lesson for everyone, not only for Jews, especially in this time of challenges, of a pandemic. We need culture. All human beings need culture. What do we miss? We miss going to the theater. We miss going to concerts. We miss going to live in-person lectures. We should never give up on culture because it's what enriches our life and gives us meaning. And these heroes showed us the way, and perseverance and commitment to a life of the spirit and a life of the mind. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm Mark Mulder, Manager of Curatorial Affairs at the Zuckelman Holocaust Center. I can't wait to dive into some questions with you, David, about your fascinating book and also your talk today. I can tell you that this is a story and an exhibit and a book that has meant a lot to me and has impacted me quite a bit working with it. One of the questions that I'm going to start with is asked several times in the chat and in the Q&A, which, by the way, if you have questions for David, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Why smuggle the artifacts into the ghetto?
It's a good question. There were other ways that they had so many means of smuggling. I can't even go through all of them. But the idea of smuggling into the ghetto had multiple purposes. First of all, if it was in the ghetto, it was in Jewish territory. It was nearby. You knew where it was. So in some ways, you felt it was safer than leaving it somewhere out there in the city where, who knows, maybe a Pole will come along, see it and use it as fire, sort of burning material for their oven. Also, if it's in the ghetto, you could retrieve some of it even to read in the ghetto, or to, there were schools in the ghetto to be used in the school, so it could actually be put to some kind of use. And that's where the bunker was. They really felt that it would both be useful and safer if it were taken there.
Alec asked a question that I think is probably on a lot of our minds as well. How did the group prioritize which books and papers to smuggle?
Very good question. Short answer is there are a lot of spur of the moment decisions. There are Germans, supervising and moving from room to room. You don't have a lot of time. Luckily, they're just different piles, and Germans are not keeping track. One of those piles the Germans don't know is the pile that you're keeping for the end of the day to smuggle under your clothing. But there's some easy criteria. If you've seen a book a second, third, or fourth time, you don't rescue more than one copy. So duplicates, triplicates, quadruplicates, you let them be destroyed. Other than that, what's interesting to me, obviously smaller things were easier to smuggle in this way than large things. But for me, the most important thing is there were no ideological or political criteria. In other words, Schmerke, who was a communist, didn't say, I'm going to smuggle only leftist socialist literature. I don't give a damn about the religious stuff because I'm secular. In fact, Schmerke risked his life for religious books that he tied around his waist. So there was a very broad conception of all Jews are in danger, all Jewish culture is in danger, and therefore all types of Jewish culture must be rescued. Last thing I'll say about prioritizing is the writers, being writers, had a kind of bias for literary material. That is, the letters by Sholem Aleichem, manuscripts by authors, including rabbis. So that was simply a kind of personal preference of theirs, that literary material must be saved.
Mary asks, did the individuals volunteer or were they chosen to do the sorting?
The heads of this brigade approached people and hired the staff. People could refuse, and people did refuse to work there for various reasons. In fact, Rachael Krinsky thought long and hard before she agreed to work there because she didn't think she could handle it emotionally. She didn't think going every day and seeing Jewish books being destroyed, she wasn't sure she could handle that. Other people had more pragmatic reasons to turn down the job. It's not a great place. If you're trying to barter, to get a loaf of bread or potatoes to take back home, there's nobody to barter with. This is an all Jewish work brigade. If you work at the train station or you work in a factory, there'll be Poles, there'll be Lithuanians, and you can, do a little bit of business and get food. These people decided, no, they're not going to be able to smuggle in food. They'll smuggle books instead.
I don't know if this is going to be an easy one to answer quickly, but Michael asks, what happened to the items that ended up in Germany? I know we can maybe talk a little about Offenbach, but I know it's a big question.
It's a big question, but I always don't include it in my talk, waiting to see if somebody will ask this question. And I know it's a good audience because someone asked this question. The short answer is yes. The material sent to Germany was discovered after the war in Frankfurt and near Frankfurt. Frankfurt was in the American zone of occupied Germany. There was a British zone, a Soviet zone, even a small French zone, and an American zone. That is important because the British had a problematic relationship with Jews then because of the Palestine issue. And the Soviets were Soviets. The Americans, when they found this material and much, much more, eventually, after much hemming and hawing, decided that the Vilna material should be sent to the YIVO in America, in New York. And therefore, very ironically, the material that the Germans sent to Germany, all of it, the Vilna material, ended up being sent to New York and became accessible to scholars, to Jewish readers from the late 1940s on. Ironically, the material that stayed in Lithuania is the material that was in the desert, you could say, for 40 years. In other words, no one knew about it, no one used it for a full 40 years.
Aaron asked specifically about paintings, but I wonder if you could speak about some of the other types of objects that were rescued by the Paper Brigade.
You saw in the images, there are paintings, there are sculptures, there are probably the most famous artistic object are two models of the Vilna Ghetto and the city of Vilna that were designed by the engineering department of the ghetto. In other words, Jews in the ghetto designed, at the Germans' command, a model of what the city looked like and a model of what the ghetto looked like. And the Germans wanted it so that they could, plan whatever operations they wanted. And those survived. And one of them is in Lochamei Ghettot in Israel today. So there are many types of artifacts and art. And the art, most of it, not all of it, whatever survived, is at the Jewish Museum in Vilnius today. There is a Jewish museum in Vilnius today, and they have received back not the books, not the papers, but the artwork.
There is a question asked, is there an active Jewish community in Vilnius today?
There is a Jewish community in Vilnius today. There are estimated 2,000 Jews in Vilnius and 2,500 Jews in all of Lithuania. Just to give you some sense, in all of Lithuania, immediately before the war, there were 250,000 Jews. So now there are 2,500. That's 1% of what there was before the war. There are basic Jewish institutions. There's a synagogue. There's a community center. There are even two schools, one Chabad, one. So there is a Jewish presence, but I must say it's rather sad. Of course, they're small, they're a remnant, and I often tell my students that Jews in Lithuania are like Native Americans here in Manhattan. There are virtually none. We all know Manhattan was once belonged to a Native American tribe, and I guess I should feel some guilt, but I don't really feel much guilt about, and that's more or less how Lithuanians view Jews. I mean, they heard there were once Jews here, but I don't see them. And, you know, that's the past for Lithuanians.
Jody wants to know if the friends that came in at lunchtime to the Evo building and smuggled the items faced repercussions if they were found with Jewish items.
Oh, definitely. In fact, the woman I mentioned, Anna Shemaitya, somebody, a neighbor must have informed on her, and she was arrested by the Gestapo, and she spent the last year of the war in a concentration camp. She wasn't murdered, but because of her interaction with Jews and rescuing Jewish materials, she was sent to a camp.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit. I will admit we lost internet briefly during your talk, so was out for about 5 minutes. If you could speak a little bit to the relationship between the Paper Brigade and the FPO and the resistance in the ghetto.
That's a big topic. There's a whole chapter about that in the book. They collaborated, as you could have assumed. Now, that bunker was built mainly for arms, but the FPO said, of course, please keep the books there. So both sides helped each other. You'd be surprised, but the FPO got help from the Paper Brigade. The FPA needed to know how do you make a hand grenade? How do you make a Molotov cocktail? They needed some munitions manuals. And actually it was the Paper Brigade that, going through these many collections of books in that building, and there were not only Jewish collections, also Russian collections, found munitions manuals that they smuggled in and gave to the FPO, to the partisans. So it really was a symbiotic relationship of both helping the other.
Margaret wants to know if there's any chance your book will become a movie.
There's always a chance, but I'm not holding my breath. There will be a documentary in another year or two on Holocaust resistance, which will have 2 or 3 segments, and one of the 3 segments will be on this story. And I was in Vilnius this past summer filming for the documentary.
Wonderful. We have time for one last question here. I'm looking for a specific one for you. Well, I'll do this one quickly. This is a quick question. What was the age of the smugglers, the age ranges?
Good question. Of course, the heads of this brigade, Crook and Kalmanovich, were the old men in the group. They were both in their 40s. And I'm sorry, Crook was in his 40s, Kalmanovich is already in his 50s. So they're the old men, but everybody else, other 3 heroes I mentioned, are people in, under 30. Right, so they're relatively young and vigorous people.
Well, thank you again, David, for joining us this evening. To order a copy of David's book, the book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis, click on the link in the chat or call the HC for more information. Please visit the Book Smugglers special exhibit, which is on display at the Zuckerman Holocaust Center through May. We are very grateful to our presenting exhibit sponsor, Beverly and Robert C. Rosenfeld, and to exhibit sponsors, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, the Karp family, Jackie and Larry Kraft, and Michael Leibowitz for the generous support in bringing this exhibit to Michigan. On February 23rd, join us for 75 years of Holocaust cinema with Rich Brownstein, a leading expert in the history of Holocaust films. Rich will discuss the most successful Holocaust films ever made, as well as the impact of Holocaust genre films on cinema. You can register for the program at holocaustcenter.org/February. Thank you for watching. Please stay safe and have a great night.